Nainamane. Nadlu Tampendi, Ganama Yuna, Yirmatanya, Wamataranyako. Ganama Yunako, Yotako, Taikaringa Tawila. Panako Tapa Puruna, Bulcho, Wicho Yacha Kuma Nadlu. Panadlu Wadu, Terlatina, Mankoriadlu. Nalu Tampendi, Hramanjeri, Naranjeri, Anangu, Adnamatna, Naranga, Mayuna Kuma Yalala, La Yalala. Mani Nabudni, Yancha in Barendi, Ghana Yatanga, Bilyanina Yatanga, which with respect to Ghana speakers, I have been hoping to say, we acknowledge the Ghana people and their spiritual relationship with the land as the traditional custodians of the Adelaide region. We acknowledge their living culture, heritage and beliefs. We also acknowledge the Naranjeri, Hramanjeri, Anangu, Adnamatna and Naranga and other Aboriginal peoples here today and welcome them to this meeting on Ghana land. May we walk together in harmony in a spirit of reconciliation. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Lynn Arnold. I am the chair of the trustees of the Don Dunstan Foundation, and it's my particular pleasure once again to be involved in some way with this Migration Update Conference. The Migration Update Conferences have been happening now for the past 4 years and have become something of an institution in the discourse on migration in our community here in Adelaide. Not just about the impacts for South Australia, but indeed the entire Australian migration context. We have, of course, been working with Professor Graeme Hugo's Australian Population and Migration Research Centre in providing this particular conference, and appreciate, of course, also the support of both Flinders and Adelaide University and of the Government of South Australia. And it's a pleasure to see representatives of all here today. I welcome Grace Portalese, the new chair of the Multicultural and Ethnic Affairs Commission, and Andrew Parkin and Leonie Hardcastle from Flinders University. We have a fine lineup of speakers today. I do have to say that one of the speakers will be speaking from a distance. That is to say, he will be speaking through another voice. Unfortunately, Professor Stephen Castles has been unable to make it to the conference, but his paper is prepared, and Graeme Hugo will be speaking to that paper after he has spoken to his own paper, his own migration update that he always gives us so very informatively as part of these conferences. But it's a particular pleasure that we have today with us the Honourable Zoe Bettison, State Minister for Multicultural Affairs, and also the Federal Parliamentary Secretary for Social Services, Senator the Honourable Concetta Fierravanti-Wells. And we welcome both of you to our conference this morning as well. And so now it's my great pleasure to invite Zoe Bettison to come to the podium here to give us the opening address. As you've seen her bio details. Zoe, in fact, is the third member for Ramsay. I was the first member for Ramsay, so in a kind of way she's Lynn Arnold III, representing a great area of our state. But more importantly, she was elected in 2012. She has passionate interests in training, education, business investment, as you can see. She is a member of the Cabinet, and she also holds a BA from Flinders and an MBA from the University of Adelaide. So Zoe is a great addition to the Cabinet team in South Australia. It's a pleasure to have you here, and I now call on you to open our conference for us. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased to be opening this conference on behalf of Premier Jay Weatherill. The South Australian Government is a great supporter of today's event, and we really value the work of the Dunstan Foundation in coordinating it. The Migration Update is the only annual conference of its kind in Australia, and we are proud that it's happening here in Adelaide. I'm sure everyone is looking forward to the update from the Director of the Australian Population and Migration Research Centre, Professor Graeme Hugo, on local, national and global migration issues. The conference is unique, and perhaps that is why, now in its 4th year, it continues to deliver. This year, the program pays close attention to the settlement needs of migrants. It examines the concept of sustainability in migration across a number of areas, including skills, employment, and the needs of the whole family, schooling and care for older people, The list goes on. As it did last year, it will also look at migration and environmental impacts. As Multicultural Affairs Minister, I'm always talking to people about migrants I've met and their contribution to South Australia. And one of the greatest stories we have in Australia, and many of you will be aware, is of the recent vice-regal appointment of His Excellency Hugh Van Lee as the Governor of South Australia. His story of getting on a boat from a refugee camp and coming from Malaysia and sailing into the Darwin Harbour with his heart in his mouth, only to be greeted by, a fisherman in a tinny, raising a stubby saying, "Welcome to Australia." It's a story told many times, and rightly so. Since then, he's contributed much to our society in his regulatory role at the Australian Securities and Investments Commission, as well as serving South Australia as energetic chair of the Multicultural and Ethnic Affairs Commission. As the Governor says himself, he is a refugee success story, but his appointment is also a reflection on our community. It also speaks the benefits in diversity and fostering a more creative society and a deeper and more inclusive understanding of our national identity. But for all the benefits of multiculturalism, one cannot ignore the challenges which face recently arrived refugees and unskilled migrants. People who maintaining a sense of belonging and well-being cannot be sped up enough. As I've already mentioned, this program pays close attention to the settlement needs of migrants. Equitable access to housing, education, health and justice are important for everyone. But like that of our new Governor, there are many inspiring stories out there. In my own electorate of Ramsay, which is in Salisbury and Parafield Gardens, there are now many people of Bhutanese Nepalese heritage who arrived in Adelaide after sometimes 2 decades in a refugee camp. They spent much of their adulthood in this transitional place. However, within 6 years of arrival, Bhutanese people in South Australia, through the state government-supported Home Start program, have more than 100 home loans between them. It's a pretty extraordinary outcome. They were kind of, not going forward, not going back for a very long time as they were in a refugee camp in Nepal. Now they're here and nothing's stopping them. They're putting their roots down and they're ensuring their financial security and providing an asset for their children in the future. The Bhutanese community are choosing to invest in our state. I'm sure that many of those of you who have worked with our local newly arrived communities would have had your own stories to share, but this is one that's made a big impact on me. Obviously, from a state level, we've benefited from migration for a long time, and that migration is part of our future. Just last month, the Premier announced his plan to drive growth and jobs locally, and up there in the top 10 economic priorities is promoting South Australia's international connections. The Government of South Australia sees that our continued prosperity depends in part on our international connections, alliances and exports, attracting foreign direct investment that connects us with overseas markets, capital and know-how. The Premier is committed to building on our proud history of multiculturalism. In closing, I'd like to highlight the Dunstan Foundation's crucial role, along with its conference partner, the Australian Population and Migration Research Centre, in providing a space for exploring migration issues. Today's program provides a real opportunity to identify new relationships and directions that enhance the current approach to migration issues. In short, we are all here because we care about our society and the future we are creating. While we may not all share the same views, ideas or opinions, we've all come here to update our knowledge and learn from each other. And that is why the Government of South Australia is pleased to be one of the supporters of this event. And on that note, I'm delighted to declare the 2014 Migration Update open.
Thank you very much indeed, Zoe, and you made reference to the swearing in of our new governor, Hugh Van Lee, the 35th governor of South Australia, and all the issues that came so very much into focus on that occasion, and actually represents a kind of mental imagery of what we hope this state has been and will be about. But we do need, therefore, to address the issues that come from that. How do we play our part in the world in terms of being part of that migration patterns, be they forced through refugee status or be they part of economic migrations or whatever. And indeed, so from an external plus an internal point of view, that's been amongst the themes of the Don Dunstan Foundation's interest in this matter. I should have acknowledged before, of course, Bill Cossey, Chair of the Board of Management of the Don Dunstan Foundation as well. Of course, the Don Dunstan Foundation builds on the memory of the late Don Dunstan and of his vision for a society that was a fairer society, an open society, a society that provided opportunity for all. And so the Foundation carries on those traditions in trying to explore ways in which the current or the contemporary issues can be further examined. So thank you very much, Zoe, for your comments. Now, it's my very great pleasure to ask the Senator, the Honourable Concetta Fierravanti-Wells, Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Social Services, special responsibility for multicultural affairs and settlement services. Elected to the Senate in a casual vacancy in 2005, then elected in the following election and then re-elected in 2010. She entered into the ministry in 2013 on the coming in of the Abbott government. I had the pleasure of meeting the Senator when I worked with Anglicare, and we had annual briefings as Anglicare with both shadow ministers and shadow parliamentary secretaries and federal ministers and federal parliamentary secretaries once a year. And I knew on that occasion of the very strong passion and interest that the Senator has in the area of aged care, particularly in the area of called issues, community and culturally and linguistically diverse communities, and the ageing sector, and just now understand her ongoing interest and commitment in areas such as with Alzheimer's research and so on. But today she's here in the context of migration and settlement services, and we're looking forward to hearing what the Senator has to say. Would you please join me in welcoming Senator Fierravanti-Wells.
Thank you. Can I start by also adding my acknowledgement to the traditional owners? Can I also acknowledge the Honourable Zoe Bettison, Lynn Arnold, Bill Cossey, Grace Portalese, academic contributors, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted this morning to represent the Minister for Social Services, the Honourable Kevin Andrews MP, to address this important conference. The Minister has asked me to pass on his apologies and extend his best wishes for a successful conference. As Parliamentary Secretary with special responsibility for multicultural affairs and settlement services, I welcome today's initiative to explore the question of sustainable migration for the future. I recognise and appreciate the highly valuable work that all of you in this room do. For 25 years prior to becoming a senator, I was actively involved in a wide range of community activities, and since 2005, given my various portfolio activities, I have continued this involvement across the broader community, and I have seen that community organisations and the wider settlement and multicultural affairs sector are filled with dedicated, hard-working people who want to help others and make a real difference in this area. The success of Australian multiculturalism arises very much from the commitment to the common elements that unite us, combined with the respect and understanding of our social, cultural and religious differences. The Australian Government is fully committed to this policy, and that commitment was reiterated by the Prime Minister in his speech to the National Press Club last night. Sustainable migration is vital to our national interests and has been an important part of the Australian story since the end of World War II. Back then, it was viewed that we needed to embark on one of the most ambitious nation-building projects ever seen. We needed to populate or perish. And some 70 years later, we've succeeded in implementing decades of growth, change and the redefinition of ourselves as a modern nation. Over these decades, successive governments have made decisions about the migration program, always keeping in mind that it needs to not only help build Australia, but be sustainable. In that time, some 7.5 million people have arrived here, including 800,000 humanitarian entrants. Today, 1 in 4 of our 23 million people were born outside Australia, and 45% of Australians, almost half of us, were born overseas or have at least one parent who was. The post-war immigration program has benefited our lives in many ways, and these changes have enhanced our economic, social and cultural fabric and have enriched us as a nation. My own story and that of my family is part of this greater narrative. My parents were migrants from Italy who came here to forge a better life for themselves and for their children. I understand the challenges facing new arrivals as they settle here and build new lives. I also know about the wealth and potential migrants represent in terms of Australia's future. To date, we've succeeded in one of the most ambitious nation-building programs the world has ever seen. We've reached this point largely through planned migration. Now we are faced with the challenges of an ageing population and our future needs. We must ensure that we do all we can to meet the nation's needs in a sustainable way. Both temporary and permanent skilled migration programs must be robust and must ensure that business is protected from labour and skills shortages and the economy continues to grow. Employer sponsorship is a significant feature of our temporary and permanent skilled migration programs, and we must continue to ensure they focus on real vacancies in the labour market that cannot be filled locally. In the permanent program, employer-sponsored migration, including regional-sponsored skilled migration, will continue to be given the highest processing priority. Our permanent program also includes an independent stream that focuses on individuals with specialised skills who will help build Australia's human capital for the future. The Australian Government considers the permanent migration intake annually, making adjustments to the numbers and categories of migrants accepted by Australia. These adjustments are informed by economic modelling, international research, net overseas migration, community consultations, and the most up-to-date economic and labour force forecasts. Under this program, in 2014-15, 190,000 people will become permanent residents of Australia. Skilled migration will account for around 2/3 of the program. It is designed to meet our economic and social needs, and the total program places are broken down into planning levels for each stream of program and visa category. In 2013-14, the 190,000 places covered 128,550 places for skilled migrants, 60,885 places for family migrants, 565 places for special eligibility migrants. The skills stream comprises around 68% of the program, while the family stream comprises 32%. In addition to the permanent program, temporary migration is a significant feature of modern Australia. At any time, there are more than 1 million temporary visa holders in Australia, excluding New Zealand citizens. And like permanent migrants, these temporary visa holders make a significant contribution to our country, whether in supporting major industries like tourism and international education, facilitating trade, or filling skilled or seasonal vacancies in the labour market. Some of these temporary arrivals, like international students and temporary workers, are likely to stay for longer, and some will undoubtedly seek to become permanent citizens and residents in future years. This all needs to take place in a balanced way. Where demand for places in the migration program exceeds the number of places available, there are a number of mechanisms available to ensure the number of visas granted is in line with the annual planning level. And one of the government's main goals for migrants, including humanitarian entrants, is to have new arrivals reach self-sufficiency and full community participation at the earliest point. We have a focus on English language skills, education and employment, and view these as necessary ingredients to ensure people can not only participate in, but contribute to our society. Many who come to Australia under the migration program speak English, are job ready and keen to participate to further education. However, where this is not so much the case, for example, for our refugee and humanitarian entrants, the Department of Social Services offers a range of support to help equip eligible migrants with the requisite skills, knowledge and education as they strive to build new lives in Australia. The transfer of settlement and multicultural programs to the Department of Social Services gives an excellent opportunity to connect early settlement support with other mainstream programs. These include English tuition and advice and assistance with many aspects of community life, such as employment, the law, healthcare and education. It is vitally important that the government maximises the benefit of every place in the migration program. While I have given figures for the current migration intake, immigration to Australia is not just about numbers. The composition of our intake matters in terms of meeting our challenges, building the future and achieving the best economic and labour force outcomes from each place. Since World War II, we have proven that balanced and sustainable migration can be used as a successful tool in building our nation and preparing for the future. We have built one of the most cohesive societies on earth. And to ensure that Australia continues to reap the benefits of immigration, we must be alert to maintain the integrity and purpose of our migration program. This program cannot be successful without the support of the Australian people. Program integrity is an essential part of earning that support. This will ensure that migration delivers social and economic strength, prosperity and unity, and continues to contribute to a thriving and cohesive economy. I'm very proud that Australia is a world leader in the provision of settlement services. Our approach recognises the important support that settlement services provide to newly arrived migrants and refugees as they adjust to a new life in Australia and start making valuable contributions to our economic, social and cultural development. Our settlement programs are an important element of the government's vision of a society in which all Australians are valued and have the opportunity to fully participate. Learning English, having a secure job and gaining a quality education are critical to migrant contribution to and participation in all aspects of Australian society. I have called this the 3 E's. We need to recognise and capitalise on the productive diversity of Australia's multiculturalism. Our diversity brings economic and social benefits for all Australians and is a big part of what makes our nation strong and prosperous. Recent research linking the 2011 census with the Department of Social Services settlement database shows good employment outcomes for migrants in the labour force, with 91, almost 92% employed. This research also demonstrates the importance of the English language with higher unemployment rates for those not proficient in spoken English. Findings from the Building a New Life in Australia longitudinal study indicate that newly arrived humanitarian migrants have high rates of engagement in English language classes and other types of studies. These trends are very encouraging. We must continue along this path to ensure that the next 70 years ensure greater prosperity for all and security against the challenges our nation will face. Migration has been a key part of our history and will continue to be an important part of our future. Thank you. Thanks, Lynn.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Senator, for that comprehensive wrap-up of policy and the program initiatives at the federal area, and that has been very helpful for us today. We appreciate your comments on that and note your noting the importance of program integrity and if we are to have such fundamental reliance upon migration in our country as we have had, not just since the Second World War period, though that has been the notable one, but essentially, of course, we had large migrations happening in the ever since first European settlement to this country. Now, the issues that have been raised by both Minister Zoe Bettison and by Senator Fierravanti-Wells, you will notice will be coming up again and again in the various papers that we have given to us during the day. I mentioned to you a few moments ago that unfortunately Stephen Castles can't be here, so his paper will be précéded by Graeme Hugo after he's done his migration update in a short while. And also, given the fact that there was the 457 review report yesterday, I understand that Peter MacDonald may be making some comments on that before the morning tea break. So now it is on to the business of the day, and this year's topic examines following questions and many more. Does having people migrate to Australia on balance stack up as beneficial or in some way damaging to Australia? Or is it really just a series of checks and balances with no real overall impact, positive or negative? And what is the concept of sustainability? What do we mean by that? And does that have just a resource component to it, or does it have a human component in terms of the quality of the life of those who make up the population of Australia through having migrated to this country? These points will be dealt with throughout the day in the presentations and in your discussion of those presentations. And so once again, it will be, I am sure, a stimulating day before us. We had a lot of facts and figures given to us by the Senator, and I appreciate that. We have got used to having an excellent summary of migration update given to us by Graeme Hugo, and each year the wealth of information he gives us provides us with a very important jumping off point into the discussions of the day. So I'm now going to ask Graeme Hugo if he can deliver the... Yes. Yes, I was trying to see where you were, Graeme. So would you please join me in welcoming Graeme Hugo, who is the Australian Research Centre Professorial Fellow.
Thanks very much, Lynn. Honoured guests, ladies and gentlemen, it really is a great pleasure to be here again. One of the fantastic things of this event, which has now become a regular thing in South Australia, is that we have the opportunity to bring to Adelaide the best thinkers and scholars in the whole area of migration, and also they happen to be my friends, which is, I think, a distinct plus, and this is especially the case this year, where we have, I think, some really excellent migration scholars with enormously broad and deep experience in the area. Now, as Lynn suggested, my job is to provide a statistical snapshot as a background to the discussions of the day. And each year I try and summarise with the data that's available, some of the major developments. I try not to be too parochial and just deal with South Australia, but look at some global trends as well as Australia as a whole. It's a little bit hampered this time around in that we haven't had a full release of 2013 and 14 migration data, but I've been able to put together some material on that year. I want to begin though by pointing out the importance of not just data, but information and evidence. Migration is an incredibly contested area, and so much of the debate and discussion about it is really not informed by evidence. And I think there's an enormous responsibility to develop high-quality information to actually have an informed discussion, because there will always be a discussion. Migration always is going to have positive and negative dimensions. But the arguments are so polarised around it that very often they end up being debates rather than discussions. And I think what we need in Australia is a really informed discussion, not just among the experts, but for the community as a whole. Globally, international migration data is very, very limited. There have been some attempts to put it together, and the World Bank and the OECD, the United Nations, have done a great deal in this area, but it is still very much lacking, and particularly lacking for low-income countries, and it's lacking in terms of not giving us much information about non-permanent mobility. Australia is blessed, actually, from a demographic point of view, in terms of its migration data. We probably have the best set of migration stock and flow information of any country. We do have some limitations, and some of the publications which were developed by the old Bureau of Immigration Research have been discontinued within the Department of Immigration, and I think that's been a major a drawback in terms of informing public discussion about migration. But we do have really very, very comprehensive data on movement in and out of the country. The ABS and the census has a terrific suite of migration-related questions, and there have been some, I think, fantastic developments through the data linkage program linking the settlement database, as the Senator pointed out, with the results of the 2011 census, and already it is shedding some light on the migration outcomes of different visa categories of migrants, and I think this is an excellent initiative. The longitudinal survey on recently arrived refugees, which came out of a study we did on the economic impact of refugee settlement in Australia, I think is a fantastic initiative as well, and the results are just starting to come out from that, and I think that will really inform our discussion about the adjustment of refugees into Australian society. I'll just make a few remarks about some global trends before moving on to look at Australia. Recently, the United Nations released its latest report and suggested that in 2013 there were about 230 million people living outside of their country of birth. Now, this doesn't include all countries because many African countries, for example, are missing from that database, but you can see here that there has been a really substantial growth in that overseas permanent migration, which is represented by this data. But the reality is that temporary migration has increased even more, and that doesn't tend to be reflected in that data source. Some of just the key findings from that information, which I find interesting. We tend to think about migration, particularly from an Australia perspective, as south-north migration, low-income countries to high-income countries, from Asia and Africa to North America, Oceania and Europe. The last report of the United Nations showed that certainly that was the largest flow, but equally large these days is the movement between so-called low-income countries or less developed countries. Movement to the countries, the developing countries of Asia, for example. Intra-Asian mobility now is very, very substantial. There are now a dozen countries in Asia which have their own skilled migration program, which competes with Australia. So it is a very, very changed landscape, and with the Asian economy going so well, and increasing to likely be, by the end of this decade, about a third of the global economy, this migration is going to increase. So the days of Australia being the one and only and beacon of opportunity for skilled migrants within the Asia-Pacific region are gone, and there was going to be much more competition from countries, and I might add, including China, which now has its own skilled migration program, but also, of course, countries like Singapore, Japan, Korea, and several other of those rapidly growing economies. Remittances now are the second largest international flow of money after foreign direct investment. Remittances now are estimated by the World Bank to be 3 times higher than overseas development assistance to low-income countries. So it's really a very significant part of the global economy. Just looking at the distribution of destinations of migrants, you can see the United States is clearly the largest, the Middle East, very substantial, Europe is also an important destination. But there are growing significance of Asian countries as destinations. When we look at the origins, Africa and Asia stand out, as well as, of course, Mexico and South America. The refugee situation, the most recent UNHCR data show that there are record numbers of people of concern, something like 40 million total people of concern to the UNHCR, which is the largest number ever. And it continues to be one of the world's most pressing issues that does need to be addressed. And this constant problem of being faced with about 800,000 new displaced people per year and about 100,000 places for permanent resettlement. It's an equation which doesn't work, and it continues to be a significant issue. The big areas of origin, clearly Asia and Africa, are dominant. As I said, I think the Asia-Pacific region is of increasing significance in global migration. And in 2015, we'll see the formation of the ASEAN Economic Community. And part of the charter for that new community is to free up movement of people, starting with some of the skilled groups, but migration is increasingly going to be a very significant factor in ASEAN. In the Pacific countries are calling for free movement of labour to be part of the PACER Plus agreement, which will link Australia and New Zealand with the Pacific. So there is ongoing discussions there, and undoubtedly migration is going to be a very important part of the future of our relationship with the Pacific. Turning to Australia, and the Minister outlined very well our status as an immigrant nation. And I think it is important to mention the group that she did mention, that over 1 million people who are here on temporary visas at any one time, because they are in the labour market, they are using housing, they are using services, and I think it is important, and I think in our understanding of Australian migration, there is a real bias towards data which relates to permanent migration. We don't know enough about temporary migrants and what they do, where they go, and so on. This ranks very highly globally. The statistic that I often mention in this respect is that we think of the United States as a migrant nation, but that has about 18% of its population who are a first or a second generation migrant, compared to close to 50% in Australia. But the composition too is one of the most significant things, and one of the I very rarely get surprised when I look at census data, and I do look at census data a great deal, but in putting together the indicators of multiculturalism in Australia from the last census, it did come as a bit of a surprise that 1 in 5 households in Australia now speak a language other than English at home. Which is a very substantial difference from, in my generation, from the absolute dominance of Anglo-Celtic society in my childhood. But just looking through a number of those issues there, the very significant proportion of the population with a called ancestry is there. The non-Christian religion component is very, very high. When we do it for Sydney, it's exaggerated even more, with 1/3 of households speaking a language other than English in their households. So we're talking about very, very diverse societies. The ancestry question in our census has its limitations, but it does indicate some of the dimensions of our changing ethnic profile. And the fact that at the last census over 10% indicated that they were of Asian ancestry, and another 4.4% put it as their second response to the ancestry question. So that part of our population that is very closely linking us with Asia is a growing and substantial one. Now, just to summarise some of the major changes since the change of government, obviously Operation Sovereign Borders has to be the dominant element in discussing that, the changes which took place. But I think the Minister's mentioned too of the splitting of the activities of the department in terms of migration and settlement between two departments is also a very, very substantial change. The reduction in the quota for humanitarian migrants is significant, but pretty largely there have been very few changes in the overall migration program with the change of government, reflecting the fact that taking out the asylum seeker issue, there has been very, very strong bipartisanship in Australian migration since World War II. And I think that's been one of the real strengths of the migration program. However, I thought it'd be interesting to look at the changes in the name of the government department to reflect the changes in focus of the department's activities. Starting with Arthur Caldwell in just after World War II, it was about immigration. It was about getting bodies, warm bodies to Australia to work and to populate the country. For a little while it was integrated with Labor, which was only for a short time, but quite significant. And then with the development of multiculturalism, the department went through a number of iterations of Department of Ethnic Affairs, of multiculturalism, and so on. Then in the Howard years, it became Immigration and Citizenship, and now finally it's become Immigration and Border Protection. It seems to me that that iteration of names of the department does reflect, it does give us a sort of potted post-war history of Australian migration policy. Turning to migration and population change in Australia, we have a rapidly growing population. It isn't often recognised that we are a fast-growing population, not just by OECD standards, but by all standards, and a faster-growing population than many Asian countries. In fact, there's only a handful of Asian countries who have a higher population growth than Australia. At about 1.8% per annum, it is significant. If you look at the South Australian population growth, it's hovered around that 0.9 to 1% for most of the last decade, which is quite different to that of the early 2000s when it got down to about 0.5%. The population projections produced by the ABS, and I've presented those here for both Australia and South Australia, and I've presented them for the last three sets of projections done by the Bureau of Statistics. And I've done this deliberately because those projections reflect broadly the trends in population growth at the time they were made. And if you look at the 2051 populations projected by the ABS using their Series B projections in the 2005, 2008 and 2013 sets of projections, the variations in the Australian population at that time are between 28 million from the 2005 projections to 38 million in 2010. Now this to me is an enormous lesson about using projections and making sure you do not use them as predictions. They are really just telling you what will happen if things go on the way they are with the existing patterns of migration and so on. If you look at the South Australian ones, I think they are particularly interesting, that the 2005 projections saw the state's population in 2051 being 1.58 million, about what it is now, a bit less than what it is now. And in fact, that was what spurred the state government into developing its population policy in order to increase population growth. At that time, there was a discussion of the population policy aiming at a 2 million target by 2050. In fact, by 2008, the ABS was projecting we'd be over 2 million by 2050, and by 2013 it's talking about almost 2.5 million. So it's very important, those projections. They're very useful, can be used substantially, but they must be interpreted purely as projections and not predictions. Net migration has been a major part of our population growth. In fact, in many years, more than half the contribution of population growth comes from migration. I don't think we realise the significance of the post-war period in looking at migration in Australia. So what I've done here is to look at natural increase and net migration in Australia back to the beginning of last century. And you can see that before World War II, there was enormous volatility in net migration. You can see the Depression years with the migration loss, but natural increase was really the mainstay of population growth. Since World War II, though, it's just been very, very continued at a high level, with some fluctuations with the economy, and of course the large numbers in recent years, which are partly true, but also partly due to the revision of the method of calculating net migration. Now, I just want to look briefly at recent trends with respect to permanent and temporary migration. If we look at the numbers of migrants for the most recent years, as the net gain was about 235,000, but you can see that it did get as high as over 300,000 in 2008. The South Australian figures on the far side of the table show that it is, for the last couple of years, been around that 10 or 11,000 mark, which is not the highest we've had over the last decade or so, but does represent a very significant increase on what we were experiencing in the early 2000s. The programming number, and when I give talks overseas, I often show slides of the planning number and the outcome, because they're exactly the same. We have a totally planned, organised migration program, which, and being an island country, you can control who comes and who doesn't and who can't come. And so our planned program numbers for particular groups is always exactly the same, or maybe one or two out from that which was planned. But it's tended to be around that 190,000 mark, and it's going to be interesting to see whether there is some change in the next time round when it's assessed, given the increased levels of unemployment, the trends in the mining boom and so on, whether there is some adjustment of that downward. The increasing significance of skilled migration, accounting for around 2/3, a bit over 2/3 of the migration program, is evident there. Main countries of origin: India, China, UK, New Zealand, Philippines, so very, very significant. This just shows the difference, the numbers. The blue is family migration, and the yellow relates to skilled migration. And in this diagram, we see the significance of onshore and offshore migration. By onshore, we mean people who transfer from another visa to a permanent visa. And the fact is that in Australia now, about 1/3 of our so-called migrants are already in Australia when they get to be permanent migrants to Australia, and that onshore factor is very significant. When we think that's large, if we go to the United States, it's something like about 60 or 70%. In New Zealand, even higher. Employment sponsorship has become a very important part of our skilled migration program, that the department in the last couple of years has tried to focus the program away from more generic skills selection program through the points test, through people actually having a job or being allocated to a job before they come to Australia. The skilled migration program has 4 components. The first is the points-tested part, and in the most recent year, that accounted for 74,000 places out of the 128,000. But they are trying to increase the employer-sponsored part of it, which accounted for 47,000 places at that in 2012-13. Business migration accounts for about 7,000 or so, and that relates to entrepreneurs, people who are willing to invest $5 million in productive activity in Australia, and that's hovered around that mark for most of recent times. There's also a very small distinguished talent category. A key part of the program these days, and one which has been of enormous significance for South Australia, is the state territory sponsored and skilled regional visas, which now are accounting for about a fifth of all the skilled visas being issued in Australia, and South Australia has benefited particularly from that. It represents a part of the program which, if I've got some time left at the finish, I wouldn't mind saying something about this settlement dimension, regional development dimension of international migration, which I think has been neglected, particularly in the discussions of regional development in Australia. But this visa is very much an instrument to use migration in a developmental way for areas experiencing labour shortage or experiencing low levels of economic growth. So this diagram was just put in to show how the skill part of the migration program has just increased substantially compared to other areas like the family stream, which has stayed fairly stable over time, and its proportion in fact has decreased slightly of the whole program. Overwhelmingly these days, about 3/4 of the program is partners and spouses. It's a function of this enormous type of migration which is being neglected, I think, in a lot of the international discussion about migration, marriage migration. The corollary of young people moving all over the world is that they're going to meet other young people and they're going to fall in love. And as a result, marriage migration is really very, very substantial. I know Peter's done some work in this area showing a very significant proportion of marriages in Australia these days are between people, Australians marrying people from other countries. Marriage migration has broken down the taboos about migration in Taiwan, in South Korea, increasingly in Japan. It's the Trojan horse by which migration is actually being accepted by many of these countries. This young people travel thing, I think, has been very, very significant in changing not just patterns of migration, but I think it's changing many countries' attitudes towards migration and led to, particularly in Asia, some quite significant changes. Very different age and sex distributions between the family migration and the skill migration. The family migration is a broader age range. It has got a significantly higher proportion of females, whereas the skilled migration, there are 2 men for every woman in that intake. I should say that when we talk about skilled migration, they all aren't necessarily people who are skilled migrants. It's the whole family which is included within those statistics, and I think that's often overlooked, that there is that's a significant factor. Turning to the important group of humanitarians, that for a long time the quota or the number of places was about 14,000, 13,500, and during the time when we were experiencing significant numbers of onshore people, that proportion of that 14,000 increased, and the numbers taken in offshore was relatively small. But these days, because of the impact of Operation Sovereign Borders, it's overwhelmingly now back to a offshore category. New Zealanders, very important part of the movement. You can see here there's this unexplainable upswing in New Zealand migration around the years zero, and it's been there for a long time, and I've got absolutely no idea why it happens. And Dick Bedford and I have some interesting discussions about that. Temporary migration, and as Stephen suggests in the paper that he's prepared for this meeting, this has really been the big change in Australian migration. We've moved away from a society for those first 3 or 4 post-war decades where temporary migration, particularly temporary labour migration, was rejected as a model, which the model was being accepted very much by many other countries, but Australia rejected that model very much until the mid-1900s, and particularly a review which was undertaken where it was suggested that the model of settlement migration was too clumsy and took too long in order for business to be able to recruit skilled migrants in time. So what we've seen is a very significant growth of the 457s, and hopefully we'll get Peter to say something about the 457s in a moment, because it has been a very controversial part of the migration program over recent times. But the big growth area, which you can see here, is the one which is now the highest level, and that is the Working Holiday Maker program, which has really gone through the roof in terms of now almost 250,000 working holiday makers coming to Australia every year. I don't know what the equivalent figure of Australians going as working holiday makers to other countries are, but I'd be surprised if it's 20% that number. This is a program which has the, I think, quite laudable goals of encouraging young people to travel between countries and enabling them to finance their holidays, and I think it's something which is really a program which has got many positive attributes, but I think increasingly it has to be looked at in terms of its impact on the labour market. I think in terms of its impact on other migration categories. Is it a coherent policy to have the Working Holiday Maker program, but also to have the Pacific Seasonal Agricultural Worker program, whereby those workers are really being squeezed out by working holiday makers. But I think it is a program which must be reviewed very soon, given the very large numbers, and with the continuing financial difficulties in Europe and parts of Asia who are eligible for this, then it does mean that I think there will be a continuing demand for those places. And of course, students are a crucial part of that temporary component. The student numbers went down with the tightening, which occurred around 2011, but have now started to recover. The issue of unauthorised arrivals and the extent to which 2012-13 stands out as a very substantial increase in the numbers of unauthorised boat arrivals, or irregular maritime arrivals as they're called. However, those numbers, while they look massive in terms of this particular graph, are pretty tiny in relation to, first of all, asylum seekers globally, but also in terms of Australian migration generally. We're talking about net migrations of 250,000 people, and we're here talking about 25,000 to 30,000 people. So it's significant, it's important, needs to be looked at, but there has been, I think, an exaggeration of the scale of that issue. The impact of Operation Sovereign Borders can be seen in terms of the massive reduction and to only a trickle these days. The most recent year of IMA arrivals, Iranians, Afghans, people from Myanmar, Rohingyas, Sri Lankans and Pakistanis were the dominant groups. Just quickly on South Australia, this just shows the long-term and permanent arrivals that peaked in 2008-9 and has gone down, but the departures have continued to go up, so that the the net gain in terms of permanent and long-term arrivals has reduced. The interesting thing about the South Australian program is the dominance of two groups. The skilled migration part, which is partly the regional migration program, but also refugees. And South Australia, for a long time, following an intervention by Mr Rann, has taken above its share of refugees, and they have played a really significant and major role, not just in our city of Adelaide, but increasingly in regional areas. I just wanted to make a comment about regional migration, and I won't say very much because I need to finish. This is a book by Doug Massey, who arguably is the world's foremost migration scholar, and has influenced the development of migration thinking, I think, certainly more than any other demographer. It's a book about how in the United States there has been a quite massive change in terms of where migrants settle. And it always had been a truism that migrants concentrated in gateway cities. And that certainly still is the case in not just in the United States, but elsewhere as well. But something strange is happening. They're becoming dispersed. Now, this didn't just happen in the United States. It's happened in Australia. It's happened right out throughout the OECD. It's happened in Canada, and it's happening in New Zealand. What we have is a phenomenon, and many of us are now speculating on what it represents, but it's clearly a replacement migration in regional areas. It's a replacement of the outflow of young Australians, and with, in many areas, increasing numbers of jobs being created in regional areas. They're increasingly being met by migrants. Now, this represents a whole new set of challenges for Australia and other countries in terms of migration support services, in terms of adjustment of communities, in terms of labour market issues and so on. And I think to some extent it slipped under the radar. It slipped under the radar, I think, in migration studies, but it's mostly slipped under the radar in terms of our discourse on regional development. Regional development is still couched in terms of how do we get these people out of our cities and into regional areas? How do we get people to leave Sydney and Melbourne and go to regional areas? The reality is that people from overseas are already going into these areas. We need to be talking about international migration when we're talking about regional development as well as internal migration. And to me, I think this is going to be a significant issue into the next few years. I've gone a bit over my time, but I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.